right. Those who took the time out of your busy day to join us, we're hanging with Dan here. Dan is another incredible creator. Dan, my first question, ironically, is very similar to on our previous webinar here with Justin Welsh right before this. You are former Amazon, and now you are the opposite of working at Amazon. You're a creator and you're doing a lot of very interesting things on your own. And I think this is a broader trend that I'm fascinated by, is people who leave the, startup world, venture capital world, corporate America world, and then they move over into this creator economy world. And so I'm curious as to when did that happen for you? Was it a choice? Was it for circumstance? How did you get to where you are now? And what are some of the differences? How do you compare? How do you look back on that experience in big business, corporate America compared to solo entrepreneurship today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was always probably inclined to work for myself for a very long time. I grew up in a family of small business owners, it was the environment I was accustomed to. Nevertheless, when I was young, I was interested in computers. I liked tinkering around with software, making my own things. And like many people who like those things, I aspired to work in tech and work as a programmer. Long story short, I took the traditional route. I studied computer science, got a job at a couple of small companies. Later, at some point, I realized I might be missing out from a learning experience, not to work in one of the big companies. I I knew how to use certain things. I knew how to use a database, but I had no clue how to build a database, for example. So that was what led me to take an attempt at working in a big company. But I went in thinking this was temporary. I'm just going to get as much as I can, learn as much as I can, then maybe make some connections and figure out something on my own. Nevertheless, I think what happened, which surprised me and messed up with my wiring a little bit with my brains, is that I was getting, promoted, often rewarded, compensation-wise way beyond what I was expecting, right? And it was very hard for a long time to consider any other path. I was basically thinking, there's no way I'm going to be making more money than if I stick here. I just keep getting promoted and going, climbing the ladder. I was thinking about my golden handcuffs, literally, yes. And even though I was starting after a couple of years, very quickly I was started to notice, right, that I gained a lot, I wasn't looking forward that much, and the law of diminishing returns and everything, I was being just compensated for that. There was the other tension from the other side. It was just hard to leave it behind. And there was a period where I think I fell into the trap of thinking, of measuring my life from a financial lifetime expected value, and I was thinking this was the route. There was no other thing to do it, until I think probably the tipping point happened when I had kids, right? And I started to realize that I was basically missing out a lot on their lives. My life became much more complicated, much more multidimensional than just me working and so on and so forth. And I started to realize, I looked around me. I think probably this was the thing as well. I looked around me at all the other people who were maybe a level or two above me, and I didn't envy their lifestyle. That I didn't feel like I want to be like them. I want to have their own lifestyle. And I thought I would be fooling myself if I believed that it's going to be different for me, no matter how much more I was going to get paid, or no matter how much higher up I went. So that was, I think, the time when it clicked for me, and I realized I need to find a way to leave. Otherwise, I'm going to be stuck here forever and end up in a lifetime arrangement that just is wearing me out. At one point, it became, quite, I wouldn't say depressing, right, but very demotivating and not great. So around the end of 2018, the timing seemed right. I was wrapping up a project that my team was working on, and I thought, if I don't leave now, I'm never going to leave. So I literally just gave the notice and left without any concrete plans, right? So that's how the new chapter started. Happy to talk more about it, what I did and what I figured out along the way.
Yeah. So what was the first step? the first step was you just decided, okay, I left my job. Now I'm going to start writing on the internet, or what did that
Yeah.
beginning of that journey look like?
And it's
So-
interesting, just real quick for anyone that was on before, Justin, who we just talked to, had a completely different perspective. Was he knew he wanted to leave and started writing for about 8 months before he took the leap. So I'm very interested to hear how, cutting it right away. Where did you jump into at the beginning?
I think probably what Justin did might have been more prudent. And to be honest, I probably tried to start to think about or be creative with some things when I still had the job. I just wasn't able to do it. I didn't just find the energy, the time, and and other things, like life got into the way. So in my case, almost by necessity, I just took the plunge. I figured I'm going to be living off my savings for a while, but I thought back then, I'm going to do the traditional software engineer bootstrapping thing, right? I've been programming for all my life, professionally for about 18 years. I thought the best shot I have is to build my own software business, right? Deploy all my assets, all my skills, all my experience, and so on and so forth in one thing, and try to make it work at all costs. Nevertheless, very quickly, pretty much on the very first day, I immediately had a small crisis of anxiety. I basically realized, wait a minute, nobody knows who I am in the outside world. Like, I had a completely zero reputation. I might have had some reputation in the couple of companies I worked before, but on the internet and especially outside, nobody knew. And also, I had no marketing experience. I just didn't know how to reason about getting attention, converting it, funnel dynamics, those kinds of things. If you were to ask me back then, what does it mean to get 10,000 visits to a landing page? I had no clue whether that was easy, hard, whether that was important, whether that was consequential or negligible. I just didn't know how to think about them. So the very first step, again, sort of out of my reaction to this small crisis, was I decided I want to try to build a name for myself. Back then, I wasn't thinking about building an audience. I didn't even know those terms existed. I thought I need to start as much as possible, right? Building a name for myself, building some reputation. And I thought, let me just go out there, help people, right? Just with things that I know about, things, for example, getting into the tech industry, dealing with starting a business like I was doing, right? And all these kinds of things. I was trying to imagine, what do I have in my head that could be useful to others? And I was just going everywhere. I was going on Reddit, Quora, LinkedIn, writing on my own blog post, Twitter, Hacker News and the Hackers, Stack Overflow, doing some open source with GitHub, literally experimenting with everything, trying to help as much as possible, going where people already were. And long story short, some things stuck around. I kept doing them. Some things I gave up on them because they weren't sort of paying off what I was expecting. And again, long story short, I mostly settled on Twitter as my medium of choice. I think it's the one that sort of helped me. It's the one probably that is most compatible with the way I like to articulate myself. And the one, probably most importantly, that I found the best results out of, at least in terms of ROI, input and output return. So that's, I would say, probably a general overview. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you remember the first thing that you wrote that gave you some real signal as to what people found most valuable from you?
Yeah, I was probably lucky, I would say, because I got that signal very quickly, pretty much in the very first week. And I remember that very first week, literally the first week I was self-employed, I was thinking, like, what might be something that the communities that I was already part of, like, I was a daily visitor of a couple of subreddits on Reddit and maybe on Hacker News and on the Hackers. Like, I knew a little bit what those type of people like to read about, although I had never written before anything like before that then. And I think the idea that popped in my head was like the previous week, I had already spent the previous week talking with my ex-colleagues, explaining to them why I was leaving. Basically, the story that I just described a few minutes ago, that's sort of the fact that I went into working at a big company. I was excited in the beginning, then motivation declined, and sort of I realized this wasn't the path for me. And I noticed when I was talking with my colleagues in real life, this one, right, the real people that I knew for a long time, that they were super fascinated. In fact, I noticed that originally I set like a 15-minute meeting with all my colleagues, and some conversations took like 3 hours. because we kept sort of talking about things. And I thought, and that maybe the people on Hacker News and Reddit might also be interested in this take, right? And I wrote a short blog post about a 5-minute read called "Why I Quit My 500K a year job at Amazon," and catchy title, of course, right? Sort of transparency, and I sort of tried to summarize as concise way as possible, like the reasons why. What led me to leave something that looked so good and so promising behind, right? And this resonated with people, right? On Hacker News, it didn't do spectacularly well, but it got to the front page for a few minutes. It wasn't even there for a long time. But it was something that, got me immediately some attention, got me a few hundred followers on Twitter, I think about 600 followers that day from zero, and lots of comments on Hacker News, hundreds of comments, and I tried to answer all of them. And this was probably the first thing that led me to say, oh, there's people are interested. I should continue to talk about these things. And it helped me a lot, right, to keep doing it. And of course, as you probably all know, right, I mean, many other things that I tried later didn't work out as well as this. And eventually some things worked even better, but lots of trial and error, lots of experimentation, and so on and so forth.
Those personal stories are great. That why I left this, the decisions that I made. So what do your content buckets look like today? Do you still do the personal story stuff? And then what are some of the other topics that you cover?
Today, I've pretty much settled almost exclusively on Twitter, I would say, not because it's the best strategy, I think, to build my audience or whatever. Probably if I had more time or more energy, I would be still going into all these places where people are. It's just that I feel like I don't need to nowadays, right? I sort of built my own audience there, and sort of I don't feel the intrinsic energy to go write a daily blog post or sort of a weekly blog post or go to these forums and deal with all the comments and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't necessarily say that what I'm doing right now is the best thing to do for somebody who's starting out, right? I think I'm in a different situation where I feel like I have the luxury to ignore lots of other opportunities because, I just maybe don't derive enjoyment out of them, or because they don't return me in terms of ROI, they're not very effective for me. So I'm mostly just on Twitter, and I talk, I would say, sort of building in public probably is the term that commonly used, right? Although I probably do it a bit differently. Sort of, I don't necessarily just talk about my business. I mostly, it became a habit for me that everything that happens in my life, by default, I ask myself, could this be something interesting to my audience? It's whether it's something related to my hobbies, my other things that I'm doing. I'm building a custom house right now, and I've been documenting, nothing related to my business. Things related to business, of course, like data. Whenever I open my business dashboards or whatever, and I see something that might be inspiring or interesting to other people, I default to, should I screenshot this and share it? No, I don't share everything. Like, to be completely honest, there are some things where I draw the line that I might say, maybe this won't, I don't know how to convey this information yet, right? Or maybe this won't be useful to others, and I just don't do it. But sort of Twitter has been my best medium so far, the one that I've settled on, and that's how sort of my habits have evolved over the last 3 years.
I'd love to dig into the transition from just starting out on Twitter, not very many followers, and then your original first product, if I'm not mistaken, was everyone should build a Twitter audience, or everyone can build. Is that correct? And can you talk
No, actually,
through...
there was a previous info product which was called The Good Parts of AWS. It was a technical book. That's why I would probably say it was my first small win, at least financially. But back then, at the time, this was late 2019, I probably just launched 3 products pretty much at the same time within a time span of 3 months or so. I launched my software as a service business user base, which was sort of financially a failure, I would say. I spent a ton of money, ton of energy, and it's still not paying off. Almost certainly I won't recoup the investment that I took. I launched The Good Parts of AWS around December of 2019. which made about $40,000 in the first couple of months, which was very encouraging, very sort of, it was a great sign. And then soon afterwards, like about 3 months later, I built the Twitter course that you mentioned, Dickie. So very short period of time, 3 different things. And that course ended up becoming, it still is, I would say, the most successful from a financial point of view. It's approaching $300,000, which is quite mind-blowing to me. I'm still surprised. It's still making about $7,000 a month, a year and a half later. And to be completely honest, like I'm surprised, like I don't even know where these people are coming from. I'm not promoting it anymore, or directly, at least. There's a link in my Twitter bio and the usual places, but I'm still fascinated how, like, word of mouth, I suppose, is still driving attention to this thing, and it's still there's still momentum.
So let's dig into, on both of those products, you know, your approach to, how did you know those were the products to build? And I think your framework in general is this portfolio of small bets where you test a lot of things. Were there other tests going on at the time? And then how, like, what informed both the AWS and the Twitter product? I'd love to just hear your framework, because they both were successful.
Yes. I think I wouldn't say I validated any of those things. I'd like to talk more about validation, because actually I know my hot take actually is going to be that I'm not a fan of the concept of validation the way we'd like to think about it in general. I think what happened with the first product, I got inspired, I would say. That's probably what I would describe it. I saw other software developers like me doing something similar, writing a short self-published ebook without going to the traditional grueling process of finding a traditional publisher and spending, months or years doing something like that, where they did a brain dump of something that they knew in a Word doc, saved it as a PDF, and then tried to sell it themselves to their audience. And I bumped around the time before I launched my book, I bumped into someone or a couple of people doing something like this. And I wondered, what if I do that myself? Something like that. Back then, I already had an audience on Twitter of about 4,000, 5,000 followers. And I was mostly talking about programming topics, AWS topics. And there was some interest that I was noticing from people. I wouldn't call it validation. This is where my sort of, maybe my disagreement comes from. Like, it wasn't a validated signal. It was just some feedback that there was some interest. I wouldn't necessarily call it something flipped from non-validated to validated, but there was some demand. I could notice it. People were coming in my DMs asking me, what do you think about this? And where I posted a tweet about AWS topics, I used to get, a lot of likes and lots of comments. People wanted to know more. But to be completely honest, I had no idea whether there was a commercial opportunity behind any of this. Right? I just didn't know if I were to release a book, whether it was going to sell anything, whether it was going to make $100, $1,000. Right? So I would say probably I approached the book almost with the expectation that it will fail, right? That this was a highly uncertain thing that I was going to making. I noticed that there was some demand, and I did have the audience, and I did sort of satisfy some of the conditions that others that were successful had back then. But I also recognized, and I still do, and probably I appreciate even more nowadays, that I've sort of did, maybe half a dozen different products, that business activities in general are usually much more random than they seem, right? Whether something succeeds or not, or how big the payoff is, tends to be highly unpredictable. Like, I remember talking to a friend of mine before I launched my Twitter course, telling him, I'm almost certain this won't be as successful as my AWS book, because I thought, I looked at the market sizes, the Twitter account of AWS has like 2 million followers. It's something people use professionally, people pay for. It was almost a B2B product, because I was telling to professionals, right? Whereas the Twitter audience, I thought, how many people are actually going to be building an audience, right? I knew the Twitter economy, Twitter sort of numbers, that maybe a small fraction of people are actually writing tweets. So I thought I'm going to be playing into a much smaller market. To my surprise, and I still don't have a great explanation why, that this turned out to be 3 times more successful financially, and it still has higher momentum. So it will be even more. And I nowadays, after the launches of maybe 5 or 6 products, I've even more surprised how sometimes the most successful things are the ones that I least expected to be successful. and vice versa. Like the ones that I had most validation signals turned out to be the ones that led me to have false sense of their potential, right? So,
and I'm sure that happens with content too. You know, we talk about that all the time. Things that you think are going to resonate don't, and then things that you don't think will resonate do, and you're always surprised by that. I am curious, because I think a lot of people here are working on their first product or thinking about creating their first product. You talked about how, I think it was with your AWS book, you know, you noticed, okay, instead of going this whole traditional route, which I totally agree with you on, you just think of it like a brain dump. You know, you brain dump all of this stuff into a Word doc and then you put it up for sale on Gumroad or something like that. How did you think about organizing that in terms of organizing a brain dump or knowing these are the things that I need to cover? You know, did you start with word count? Did you start with these are just the main ideas that I want to talk about? How did you think about that?
I would say I started with just how much I was willing to invest. I started with the time box, and I said back then, I remember saying, I want to do this, and I don't want this to take more than a month. And I worked backward from it. Basically, how much can I fit in a month? And in fact, I had a much bigger ambition for the content, right? And I ended up down scoping as I got closer to that deadline. I cut things that I felt like I needed too much work, and sort of it was shaped. The final product was very much shaped by how much investment I was willing to put in. And this is, I would say, this is a strategy that I still employ even today. Right? That I have, you know, much more small wins along the way. I have much more knowledge, I feel like, about what works, or sort of a better sense, not knowledge, right? A better sense of what works and what doesn't. But I'm still very cautious about the fact that things are much less predictable than most of us tend to think, right? So this is the idea of small bets that I like to promote, right? That many things, despite putting in all our effort, despite making something great, having a good product, having great pricing, having great marketing, great reputation, things might still flop for seemingly random reasons. Why? Because we're dealing with humans at the end of the day, and humans are like this complex, opaque black box. You know, humans don't come with the source code of how they behave, right? If you present them this product, this is how they're going to react to it. We're, as you mentioned right before, like you don't know how people, what's going to resonate, what's going to make people take the wallet out of their pocket and pay $25, or maybe they won't if it's $50. Who knows, right? All these things. What is going to make them refer the products to their friends after they buy it, right? Also important, also very hard to predict. So I've become very ruthless in my every new venture, right? With sort of input minimization, right? And starting with how much am I willing to invest in this, knowing that there's a great chance that this will flop or won't meet my expectations. You know, sometimes things succeed moderately, but maybe the payoff that I was expecting doesn't materialize. And I work backwards from that investment. It doesn't mean that in the future, I don't go back to it and give it more attention, right? If I notice that it has lags or there's more opportunity. But I'm very careful, right? And I think it's a critical thing, something that unfortunately I don't see discussed much. I think many new entrepreneurs start idea first and, you know, start thinking about how to bring that idea to a reality. And sometimes this is what led me to the mistake with Userbase, for example. Like with Userbase, my first SaaS business, I was getting great validation signals. Right? Basically, I was building it in public. I had about 4,000 people sign up to my waiting list before I launched it. I was endorsed by highly influential people, by the CEOs of Netlify and Vercel, both of them publicly on their Twitter account, multiple times endorsed me, and they invited me to talk with their employees. I had on the launch day as well, it went really well. I was front page on Hacker News for like 18 hours, #1 on Product Hunt. Great sales day on the first day. Like, so even, you know, even financially, initially the signals were strong. I had like 40 customers, $1,500 just in the first few hours. The launch tweet got liked by Paul Graham of Y Combinator. Everything that I could have asked for signals, you know, to tell me whether this is the right thing or not. I got them. And yet, unfortunately, you know, the momentum didn't really continue, right? Unfortunately, this stalled for reasons. I could speculate and maybe take some educated guesses on why it didn't work. Nowadays, there's actually a couple of competitors, at least one in particular, pretty much in the same space, that did manage to succeed. So maybe the space wasn't a bad space to be in, but it didn't. And I think what the problem back then was that I listened too much. I underestimated the role of uncertainty and the role of randomness in business. I listened so much to those signals that I went all in. I invested way, way, way more than I was willing to lose. I feel almost embarrassed to say, but I've spent over $150,000 out of my own savings into this thing. I hired someone to help me. I spent security reviews. I bought a $25,000 .com domain name. Now, seemingly foolish things to do, but I felt like I had the validation signals. This was almost in my brain back then, almost a sure success, right? And yet, unfortunately, this nowadays is still doing only about $5,000 in annual revenue, right? So very likely I will never recover or recoup those things. So that lesson, right, definitely. And even before I launched, I was starting to feel it, right? I was already starting to notice that there's much more uncertainty than earlier I was thinking, right? And this led me to take a radically different approach now to entrepreneurship, right? Is that now I try to be even more careful, ruthlessly careful with sort of the effect of randomness, and play a different strategy, essentially, right? And knowing that I don't know what's going to work or not, I might use signals. Of course, I think, but the reason I dislike the term validation is because it seems to imply something different, something stronger. It seems like there's a quality, a property, a checkbox that you go from unvalidated to validated, that is easily measurable. And I think that leads us to sometimes take imprudent risks, right? Because if you believe that you got, 500 likes and that's validation, or 500 subscribers on your waiting list and this validation, now you start thinking differently. You start thinking about it how we tend to think when we're a much more predictable world, like when we have a regular job, right? But in business, there's just way, way much more variables that could take you in a different direction, sometimes positively or sometimes negatively, of course.
So it's a validation spectrum, I think, is the big takeaway, right? It's not an on-off switch. And yes, if something, you're getting some signals, it's, when it falls further along on that spectrum, you probably should give it more effort. And I think, but that doesn't mean all in, right? Very few things deserve all in, hence your portfolio of small bets.
I think, absolutely. I think signals is definitely something that's important. Nowadays I try to think about, I have selection criteria, I would say, for whether I choose to pursue something or avoid it, leave it to someone else, or just completely ignore it. And I would certainly say that some signals of demand is part of my selection criteria. Like I ask myself, does this seem like there's interest from me or from the market in general, right? And it depends on, of course, it depends on the domain, what that signal looks like, but it's something that I take care of. But that's not the only thing, right? There's other things in my selection criteria. Could I do this with a small amount of investment, both in terms of time and money? Could I bring this to market all by myself? Not necessarily because I believe I can do everything or believe, that I have all the skills or whatever, but I think it's a great litmus test to keep things simple, right? To not overcomplicate them and get into complex partnerships and sort of reduce my ability to remain nimble and agile and so on and so forth. For example, I like to be able to say, oh, I was going to try this, but sort of then I realized that maybe this isn't worth doing anymore. And I like having the option that I can just stop doing it without having to worry about letting some other people down or sort of harming a partner or, having to convince someone else that this is the right decision. So these are probably all part of my selection criteria that I've evolved over time, whether I'm going to be enjoying this, right? I think at some point you start to improve your selection criteria when you can afford to ignore things that are not necessarily compatible with my two preferences. I think in the beginning I was a bit more lenient with that aspect. Nowadays I'm a bit more strict. I avoid things if I feel like I would be not enjoying them, right? Or they would be something I wouldn't be looking forward to do, for example.
So you've launched a handful of products. You also have a community as well. Can you give a nutshell of what that community is, and how do you think about the differences between products and communities?
Yeah, this is a very interesting thing to talk about, actually related to what we just described. I started actually about this time last year, in December of 2020, with the idea of wanting to build my own community. Right? I started to notice there was a lot of interest on my Twitter account about people taking the plunge from full-time employment to self-employment and figuring out how to reason about money and finding opportunities and getting inspiration and, you know, sort of choosing what opportunities to pursue or not. And I was noticing there's more than Twitter could handle. Like on Twitter, some form of community does happen, but it's different, right? It's not that sort of close-knit group. Originally, back then, I started a membership product in 2020. I started a circle group, right? A circle, for those who don't know, it's like this forum platform, right, where people can post and get to ask questions and others can comment. And I was trying to make something work there. I started to seed the content myself, presenting my own sort of financial updates and asking people to ask questions and sort of inviting everyone to ask me anything. And I was trying to, you know, make the community grow. Long story short, however, this thing didn't happen in that format. At some point, I was noticing that the energy was sort of dwindling down. I was posting updates and I wasn't getting any feedback at all, no more questions. And I chose to stop do that after about a year. Nevertheless, somewhat almost not in parallel, but with some slight overlap, in November of 2021, just maybe four months ago, I decided to do a cohort-based course, similar like what you guys are doing, right, on this topic, right? I thought, let me meet with groups of 25 people or so and talk about these topics in much more detail. Basically, examine the role of randomness and uncertainty in business, study it thoroughly, and basically discuss with the group what are good strategies to have in these situations, right? And what are the things that work in a much more predictable world but don't work in this situation. This was the idea. I wasn't even thinking about a community back then, but I set up a Discord server mostly for housekeeping purposes, just to share the links to my Zoom and the slides, and maybe share some of the links to further reading and things like that. And to my surprise, a community spawned on its own on this Discord server without me doing anything actively. Right? Basically, this was just, back then, was just a single general channel on Discord. And people started asking questions, people started to get to know each other and helping each other. And again, it's just another example of how sometimes the things that end up succeeding end up being very unpredictable, not self-directed. I didn't really do anything to help this, to make this happen. And now I would say probably that the community aspect of this cohort course probably became even more valuable probably than the course itself, or at least equivalent or similar. Right, it's very fascinating. I don't really know if there's what to do with it yet. Sort of right now, I'm just keeping doing the cohort course. There's still demand for that, and the community is just a bonus for those who join. But it's very fascinating, right? It's something that it's new to me as well. Sort of, it's very fun and very interesting. I'm learning a lot from the people there. It's fun to see people meeting in real life and sort of brainstorming together without necessarily me having to. This is the difference between Twitter, right? Twitter, even though there's a little bit of community under my tweets, everything is around me, about me, right? About my tweets. Whereas this is different. This is people taking it to different tangents, things. There's even threads in different languages now that I can't even read. It's very fascinating to see happening.
What are some of the ways that you continue to nurture that community, or what are some deliberate things that you do to engage people?
I'm just trying to do what I've been doing for the last 3 years. I basically keep an eye on what's happening, and if I can help, I default to help, right? Essentially, I'm still new to this, right? So probably I don't yet have any lessons or tips to others, because this is something that happened in the last 3 months or so. But however, some things that I'm still very cautious of, this being an organic thing, being something that just happened on its own. I'm very cautious to not disrupt it too much. Like, for example, at one point I was thinking about maybe allowing people to come into the community without taking the cohort course, right? And maybe offer it as a separate product, low priced, maybe a monthly fee or whatever. But I paused that because I was cautious that maybe if more people come in quicker. Nowadays, there's this interesting dynamic that I'm doing a new cohort every 2 or 3 weeks. And sort of the fact that people come in slowly, I think paradoxically it's helping, right? It's not like there's lots of random strangers. You know, there's 20 people or so coming in every couple of weeks. They introduce themselves, they get to know each other. And there's this interesting dynamic that's working. And I'm very cautious not to touch it, to be honest, right? It's funny. That's probably the only thing that I can talk about right now. I don't know, right? I mean, maybe this time next year, I might have some more interesting insights. Maybe I will mess with it a little bit, and I will be able to share whether that was a big mistake or something useful.
Dickie, were you going to say something? I have another
No,
question.
no. I'm trying to put a few things together.
What do you feel like, Dan? Because you're obviously juggling this portfolio of different products and ventures and ideas and communities. What do you feel like is the most important system that you use on a day-to-day basis? What are you most reliant on, just in terms of just managing your own work? And do you try and create systems for each individual thing? Is there a way that you organize your day? How do you think about that?
Yeah. So, you know, I hate to generalize a lot because I think I have a very peculiar way of being productive that I'm almost certain doesn't apply to everyone. We're all different. We all worked in different ways. In my case, I've tried to arrange my life as much as possible to have as little structure as possible. I really, really enjoy waking up in the morning and having nothing planned and just let inspiration and my own motivation drive me. It's a very unscientific way of working and not very data driven, but I feel like it leads me to the right things without the necessary forcing functions. I do set some forcing functions occasionally, like when I set my time boxes. When I do get inspired to do something, as I mentioned before, I aggressively set a time box. Nowadays, sometimes even more aggressively, I say I need to do this by the end of the week, and I treat that very seriously. But when I'm not operating, those are there. Those happen maybe 5-6 times a year, maybe even less. When I'm not into those windows, I just allow myself to throw myself at random things, allow myself to get inspired. You know, I've been treating Twitter nowadays. I'm finding more value in Twitter. This is probably going to sound a bit crazy. I'm finding more value in Twitter from the consumption side than the writing side. Twitter has become my cocktail party equivalent. I bump into random conversations, right? Chance encounters that could sometimes potentially change my life, right? Inspire me to do different things. I have the option, but not the obligation, to jump into conversations that I see happening on Twitter. It's been super, super inspiring to see people talk about how they're living their life, how they're making new things, and us, right, being able to participate in those things, sometimes just observe. And I can pretty much everything that I've tried in the last 2 years or so, I can attribute it to maybe a tweet or a series of tweets that I've seen from other people, right? In my course, actually, I share my screen and I show the concrete examples, right? I mean, you know, this product came because I saw this tweet from a random stranger who I wasn't even following, doing something in a different domain, and some light bulb lit up, and I said, what if I do something similar, right? What if I try something like this, but in my own domain? And it's fascinating because this has led to great success financially and other purposes and other things. And the funny thing is that it's not self-directed. It's not like I started with a particular goal and I worked towards it step by step. I just threw myself to random things. You never know what you're going to bump into, right? And you don't take everything. As I mentioned before, I have a very strict selection criteria. For 360 days out of 365, nothing comes out of this randomness, right? But in those 5 days, highly consequential things happen, right? So it's very interesting. So I would probably say, if somebody was observing my life, right, if there was a camera installed here in my home office, probably it will seem like I'm wasting most of my days. I'm spending hours scrolling Twitter, talking with random people online, right? Just most of the time, nothing comes out of them. But sometimes, infrequently, highly consequential things happen, right? I bump into somebody, I form friendships like this, I get inspired for my own products, and it's the way I like to work. But again, like, I don't want this to be taken as this is how everyone should work. I completely understand. I know people personally, like, who probably can't function this way. They want to have some more structure, right? And I completely understand that. I think what I would encourage people to do, and this is why I dislike full-time work in general. Like, with full-time work, the problem is that it's a one-size-fits-all. There's little you can do if you realize, like I realized, that the 40-hour work week wasn't conducive to me to be productive and to be energized. There was no alternative. Maybe I could take a day off once in a while. Maybe I could quit, but if I quit and left to another job, chances are it's going to be more of the same, right? Same full-time work arrangement, 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, 3-4 weeks of vacation a year. But I like to work very, very differently, right? So I highly encourage people that if they feel like the work arrangement is not compatible with them, to try to find better, more flexible work arrangements, to be able to adapt, right? To be able to discover their own preferences and make work more compatible with how they like to work.
Yeah, a couple interesting questions here in the chat are, one, this idea of creating a portfolio of small bets, which I love. That just as a framework, and it rolls off the tongue quite nicely too. So I like it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about, as you continue to build that for yourself, do you think about it as one idea at a time? Do you ever pursue multiple at a time? Do you have ideas on different tracks? How do you think about building that?
So of course, I'm not context switching on a daily basis. It's not like I'm working on one thing for between 9 to 10 and 10 to 11. I'm working on something else. I tend to focus on one thing, especially if I'm building it or I'm making it, like, in that very high intense period of bringing something to life. I control that, as I mentioned before, by time boxing, right? But then what I like to have, for example, that sites now I don't even know the exact count. I think probably 5 or so products active on the market that I'm selling, right? I'm also doing some freelancing on the side as well, right? I have a quarter time arrangement with Gumroad that I'm fractional product management. Before Gumroad, I had a couple of other small gigs as a programmer. I like that I have the option, again, but not the obligation, to change my attention and alternate my attention to different things, depending on what I feel inspired to do, depending on what I feel motivated to do, sometimes depending on the opportunity. If it's Black Friday, I might get inspired to market some of my products that are more conducive to become, to be promoted on Black Friday. If just I get a light bulb moment about how to give more attention to one of my products that I launched 2 years ago, I can choose to do that. I like this arrangement, right? And I think it's a great way of taming uncertainty for various reasons. First of all, it's a diversification strategy, which we're probably all familiar with when it comes to investing our money. Everyone knows that it would be foolish to go all in and invest all your life savings on a single stock. Of course, if you're lucky, it might make you extremely wealthy, but we all know that the downside is huge, especially because we can't predict the future. Random things could happen. Legal stuff and wars, as we're seeing today, right? And all these things that we couldn't really predict, that could harm us a lot. So in investing or finances, we tend to diversify. It's a very similar idea. You trade in some upside for more predictability. But in addition, I think this is also helping me with my own motivation, right? And with my own, taking this thing sometimes out of the disappointment of something not working out. Whenever I was operating with going all in on something, if that doesn't work out, it feels extremely demotivating, disappointing, because now what, right? This thing failed and I've put so much effort into it. But now if I'm trying different things and something fails, not a big deal. You still feel some disappointment, obviously, because we all like to see things working, but it's not a big deal. There's still these other 4 or 5 things going on that are working. And as I mentioned, for motivation, right? I like having the option that whenever I feel inspired to work on something, I can just do it, right? It's just not feeling that if I'm working on something, I'm distracting myself from my main focus, right? I dislike that situation. So I believe lots of benefits, right? And hopefully it's something that gets more considered. I think there's a third way, like especially I come from tech, that most people who have self-employment or entrepreneurship inclinations usually consider two paths. Either have some big ambitious idea that requires investors to come in, and so sort of they go all in on that idea. That used to be a common part. The second part used to be you do it in the bootstrapping approach. You tend to curb your ambitions a little bit, right? You try to make it self-sustainable from your revenues, right? Which I tend to prefer from the first one. It tends to be a bit more realistic, right? It tends to be sort of better in general, better odds, and so on and so forth. But I think there's a third part, right? In that still don't go all in on one thing, right? Sort of let random things come to you. Don't restrict yourself. Don't constrain yourself to just one idea or one business model, right? But ask yourself, what can you do that can make you some money, like next month? Go for the low-hanging fruit, get some small wins, start to acquire some information, right, with your small wins, start to build your own reputation, right, and then build on those things. Because sometimes you start to discover also what you like doing or what you're good at. This is as well part of the uncertainty, right? I might have, a dream of building a big software as a service business, but what if I realize that I actually dislike having to be on call 24/7 or having to answer customer support questions all the time? This is part of the uncertainty of doing business, right? So I think keeping things small helps us tame uncertainty, make it easier to navigate, right? So I hope people consider this. Again, I'm not necessarily saying this is the best thing for everyone, right? But sort of to consider the third part, which can be very effective as well.
I love this. I always notice that people that come from tech tend to approach the creator world with a very specific sort of mindset. I mean, even though you mentioned, enjoying not having meetings and kind of open inspiration and free flow, there's still a lot of data-driven, systematic thinking in what you do. And I think I encourage everyone to incorporate that, because creativity without that is usually a mess and a disaster, but creativity with some constraint can be really incredible and really productive. Dan, this has been awesome. Dickie, you have any final questions you want to ask?
No, I think we want to save some questions from the chat, if anyone wants to jump in, ask us anything on. I think as those kind of flow in, if you were advising someone, say 1,000 Twitter followers, looking to start to make some small bets on figuring out what people may be more interested in buying from them, right? They've done something that 1,000 people have said what they're saying is interesting. How do you advise them to start to just probe interest on anything they might create?
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself and I couldn't.
Oh, all good. All good.
Sorry, I missed the question as I was fumbling with my mute button. Dickie, can you ask again, please?
So, okay, all good. So 1,000 followers, say someone has 1,000 followers, they want to start to probe potential products to create. How do you advise them on a validation strategy?
No, good question. I think your audience can be your market research, right? And sort of in terms of listen to what people are interested to know more from you, right? Or if you're offering something, right? I think it becomes obvious once it starts to happen. But I think you still need to have your eyes open to see it, right? Because otherwise you might still not recognize it. Again, I think my most general advice is to start giving away for free everything you know about what you like doing, what you're learning, what you're observing that might be interesting to other people. Sort of watch out when people start asking questions. That's a great sign that there's more demand. Still try to help them for free, answer every comment, every question as much as you can. then I think eventually you start to realize you have more to say or more to offer, right? Whether it's a product or a service or a course or more content, more to offer than you can fit in a tweet reply or in a DM message or whatever. And I think that spillover becomes the opportunity. I don't think you should treat it like, it's perfect validation that is a sure win, that if you're going to do it, this would be foolish. But it's a great signal, right? And I would start filtering those kinds of opportunities. Ask yourself, do I really have more to say? Is this something that maybe people could pay money for? Is this something that I could do, right, with a small amount of investment? And if not, can I shape it into something that can become small, right? Sort of, that's how I would start to think about it. 1,000 followers, I think it's a decent amount already, right? To not feel like you're tweeting in the void. You start getting some interaction, some feedback from people. It's a great place to start from. And I don't believe it's hard to do. I actually think like almost everyone can get 1,000 followers. It's almost like making friends. People asking me, can everyone really build an audience? Of course, I don't know. There's a level of scale. Then that's a different question. But getting 1,000 followers is like asking me, can you make 10 friends in real life? I feel probably almost everyone can make 10 friends in real life. Right? On the internet, making 1,000 followers. Remember that, to get followed, it's free. It's not a huge obligation from, they can always unfollow. It's not that much of a hard sell. Like the bar is not that high. It's still not super easy, right? But it's not that difficult. It's much difficult to ask people for money, that's for sure.
Yeah, the original Ship 30 cohort, I had a little over 1,000 followers.
Exactly, there you go.
The most fun time as I look back on Twitter is when you're in that build, because 1,000 people really does feel like a family. So I think a lot of listeners think you need this massive audience to start selling something. And it's really the opposite. It's way easier to start selling something when you have a small group of trusted people who have followed you, because the marginal follow, like the marginal effort of following someone with 1,000 followers versus 150, you kind of create a connection with them when you follow someone that has fewer followers, right? Because you see the number tick up and they've obviously said something versus everyone follows the people with 200, 300,000 and it's like a throwaway, right? So if you're kind of in that stage, take value in every single person that follows you, because it's a potential friend, a potential customer. They're going to tell you something valuable that you can build from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also makes, and this is all psychological, right? It makes mistakes and failures less, when you have 100,000 followers, more eyes on you, everything gets amplified. You have to even be careful. I feel more responsibility as well. There's, scale problems, right? That when you're small, you don't experience. I think it makes it easier to experiment, tinker. Nobody's going to be remembering forever what you try or what you mess up. Right? It just makes it much more easier to experiment.
All right. Well, I think that's all we got.
Awesome.
Yeah, this is good. I got
awesome,
I got a lot to reflect on here, a bunch of takeaways. So Dan, where can people find you on Twitter, your course, wherever you want to send them?
Yeah, probably Twitter is the best place to start. DVASSLLO. I have the links in the Twitter bio to everything else. But Twitter is basically where I'm every day. I try to answer every question I get. I can't really promise because, because of scale problems. But I'm very active on Twitter, and I try to engage with everyone who engages back.
And when does the next cohort of your portfolio of small bets course start?
I have spots open for the April cohort. I've been doing about 2 a month. Actually, it's just a 2-week program, so I've been doing them back to back, right? So I don't know how much demand there is. Just again, one of the uncertainties of business. But so far, I've been managing to book 2 a month roughly. So if anyone is interested, yes, in April, I have 2 cohorts open. That would be great to have you.